Awesome. We are going to dig into Python. And it should be a lot of fun. A lot of you have seen Python. A lot of you, this will be a review that you're pretty comfortable with. There might be some new bits. For a lot of you, there will be more new bits, and that's what today is for. So please ask any and all questions as I'm lecturing. I love questions. I will just let you know if it's a question that we might need to return to later. I will try to keep an eye on the participants channel. That's what I've got the two monitors for in the chat. But I miss something from time to time. So when in doubt, just please speak up. So really the goal is as we've said in very fancy words here, to utilize Python's elegant syntax and rich ecosystem. And every programming language has its own philosophy that influences its design, how the language is evolved, because as you all are learning, languages have different versions that change over time, and how it is supposed to be used, like a standard of how the community writes stuff that stretches from how comments should be written, how code should be indented, to how to use an object versus an array, questions of style and things like that. And Python is sort of known for being a language that has really strong feelings. And the saying is, in Python, like the Python way is there should be one right way to do things. And JavaScript is obviously different, and Ruby's different. And there's a lot to be said for the Python approach. And that's part of why I think it's become so popular. So just to warm us up, there's this idea, and I'll share this in the chat. And if someone can cross-post in Slack, I would appreciate it. Python code should be readable. It should be explicit. It should be simple. Programmers love to make these crazy distinctions. Complex is better than complicated, as in if there's necessary complexity. Keeping data structures simple when you can. Readability matters. And as many of you know, white space actually matters in Python, and we'll see it as I walk through the language. Really, this is all about consistency, one right way to do things, and trying to be practical. And there's this like long history of programmers loving to kind of sound like Zen koans. So there's a whole, this is a whole thing. So we are going to learn some of the core features of the Python language. A lot of this class will be in Python. Really for the next several weeks, a large amount in Python. And then when we come back to front-end stuff, we'll see more JavaScript. You all, when you graduate and start doing interviews, will want to pick one language to do your technical interviews in, because the number one thing you want is to be really comfortable with your programming language and not have to think about how to do for loops or string concatenation, or like I forgot that JavaScript has this newer language feature, and Megan reminded me. And so you want to know your one programming language really well, and that's like half the battle with technical interviews. And it is just too hard to do that for two languages. I've tried and it doesn't work. You'll be learning both in this course. There's a bit of a trade-off there. There's definitely a context switching cost, but they each have their place and they're really valuable. Python in particular, it's been really popular with scientists for a while, and there's a lot of scientific computing libraries for it, and that's a big part of its popularity. There's a sort of math-based data science type library called Pandas for Python that's gotten extremely popular for analytics and some stuff related to machine learning. And a lot of machine learning related code, even if you're not making a machine learning module, there's like a whole field of like data engineering that's essentially like cleaning up the training data for machine learning models, and Python is used for tons of that. In addition, we're going to learn the backend web framework Django later on. Python is definitely used to build web applications, and it's used for a lot of command line scripting. So it is used for all sorts of stuff. So every language has its own syntax, has a way to declare variables. Every language has data types, primitives such as Booleans or strings. right? Like, does Python have an integer type or just a number type? JavaScript, I believe, just has a number type. Python and JavaScript are both dynamic languages, I believe is the term, meaning I can set x equal to 5 and then change x to equal hello world. I can change my variable from a number or an integer to a string. Other languages like Java that I learned in school are what is called strongly typed. When you declare a variable, you have to declare what kind it is. And I have to say x is an integer equal to 5. And then if I try to change x to hello world, it throws an error. Python and JavaScript, along with languages like PHP and Ruby, and C Sharp, which is what Microsoft uses, are all what's called higher level languages, dynamic languages. Higher level, meaning a couple things. With a programming language like Java or C, once I write my code, I have to run another program called a compiler that produces another file that if I looked at it would be, it's not ones and zeros, but it might as well be. And that's what then, like, the sort of program runtime the computer actually runs. With these higher level languages, I think it's called just-in-time compilation. I don't know a ton about this, but the Python runtime or the JavaScript engine, the program that looks at our source code and runs it, compiles it and runs it and turns it into like machine code that the computer can understand and executes it in real time, which gives us a lot of flexibility. So we're going to be looking at data structures, if statements, built-in methods, common things that you do with programming languages. So it's kind of going to be like a world tour of Python. In the second half of the lecture, we're going to look a bit at test-driven development in Python and writing tests. And you saw a bit of that with JavaScript already in Jest. And really, the goal here is to get more familiar with the fundamentals, to get more practice writing Python programs. Throughout this whole course, if you're ever unsure what makes the most sense, the answer is probably to try and write some code and see how it goes. And as you get stuck or run into things you're unsure about, then refer back to online resources or videos or ask questions. A lot of programming is writing the code and learning as you go, which is actually a lot more productive than it can feel, because I know it's kind of tough. So yeah, that's the plan for today. Any kind of questions or things that people are curious about before we dive on in? Cool.
Sorry, I was delayed.
Oh, yes, what's up?
So as you were describing that we're going to be working with Python for the, I guess, first few weeks, does that mean we're going to work or start with just building a backend before we switch to the front end, if I'm getting that right?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's actually take a look. We did a little reordering of the order that stuff happens in, which we think is going to work really well. So we're not even getting to web apps until week 5. There's actually some curriculum I'm working on. It might be week 4. I've been working on some curriculum that needs to go in here, so some of this is getting shifted. But the rough structure, actually, I will just pull up the curriculum. We have a spreadsheet that we look at too. So this week is really getting familiar with these programming languages. Next week is really object-oriented programming, which is almost all Python, and learning these sort of concepts of object-oriented programming, which we're using Python, but a lot of other languages have these concepts. And this is also not going to be about web applications per se, though we'll learn a lot of things that we'll use later when we build web apps, which is why we do it, because like objects and classes are core things in Python. Next, we're going to look at like data structures and a little bit of algorithms. This is also going to be mostly in Python. The focus here is on learning some things that are valuable, both for technical interviews and that are sort of computer science fundamentals that it's difficult to go in depth in the amount of time that we have in our course, but we want to give you all like steps 1 and 2 so that as after you graduate and get into your careers, you can continue with steps 3 and 4. And also because this stuff is important for the technical interview process. Then around week 4, we're going to start getting into stuff that's specific to web apps. And Francisco's planned a bit of a preview week where we don't go in depth, but we sort of build a bit of a full stack app, the front end with the stuff in the browser and the back end stuff on the server. And then we focus a bit more on the front end browser stuff, which will be more JavaScript. And that's where we'll learn this really interesting JavaScript framework, React.js. Then we transition a bit and we spend some time looking at databases and SQL, which are their own thing, though we then use it, the database being something that lives on a server on the back end, so to speak. And we'll be using that then, learning sort of how to build the back ends of these web applications with Django, which is a Python framework. There's a lot of that. There's a lot I have glossed over. Like we'll talk more about HTTP and how the internet works and what APIs are. And then around like week 10, basically the last 5 weeks, we have classes and lecture, but it starts to drop off. And the last 2 to 3 weeks, I don't think we have that much lecture at all. And it's really coding project time on personal and group projects. Like there's a couple solid weeks here of just project work. Unfortunately, the holidays make it a little tricky. But so that's sort of like the overall arc of everything. And does that help contextualize stuff a bit?
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, I tend to sometimes, I've been told like someone will ask a question and I can just say yes or no, and then I give a much longer answer. So if I do that, sometimes I do apologize. But all of this starts with Python, because this is like the raw material that we use for everything, and knowing our programming languages is really the most important part here. So just diving right on in. And actually what I am going to do is, for my own sake, I'll talk a bit more about this later, but I'm going to use this little command line program find that I can use to find stuff. And then I'm going to pipe that into this other command line program that I installed. And I'll share this link with people. Actually, I'll just share it now very quickly. Don't worry too much about this right now, unless you are really interested. But it's a little nifty program, because what it lets you do is something like this. And now what I've done is this little program enter is it's watching. I've got this find command and it tells enter what files to watch, and enter watches. And if I make a change by editing a file and then saving it, enter then runs this command. So I'm going to use this so that I don't have to constantly jump back and forth as I go. And this is actually a really nice workflow. And there are a lot of tools other than enter that can be used to accomplish this. And we're going to sort of see that as we talk more about test-driven development. So kind of starting off with Python, every language has its primitive types, right? Like the most basic thing. I mentioned the example of numbers, because on a low level, computers handle integers different than decimals, or what are called floating point numbers, since everything has to get turns into 1 and 0s in binary at the end of the day. And languages like C or Java, strongly typed languages, there's often an integer type. Python really just has a number type, as I believe does JavaScript. Though both these languages have like sort of much less used types and exceptions for like handling really big numbers or certain things. Python, like JavaScript, has a nifty built-in language feature function type called type that we can use to see what the type of something is, which is not perfect, but and actually I may have spoken wrong here because it looks like Python does have an integer type. In fact, if we change this to 4.5, let's see what happens. So this is some of the fun stuff with dynamic languages is we don't have to think about this. And let me go ahead, in fact, and we'll do a quick Google search here. Python number types, because I thought I knew this, but I actually had this wrong. So this is a good thing to know. So I was absolutely wrong. Python does really have, so to speak, under the hood, because we don't have to declare them, but 3 different kinds of numbers: int, float, and complex. And I haven't written Python professionally, but I've done an awful lot of it since joining Code Platoon, and having worked professionally with similar languages like JavaScript, Ruby, PHP. I very rarely have had to declare a specific number type in any of those languages. When I worked at Reaver, we worked with money because people can buy and sell music gear through that site. And working with money, you have to be very careful in how you round cents and fractions of cents, so everything adds up right. And there was actually a specific like library, like a package we installed to do that. So usually with these languages like Python, if you really have to care about numbers, often there is some other library that you might use specific to your use case. But there are, I guess we can declare the different types in Python, but on a practical level, as I said, I don't think we would ever do it. And as we've seen here, but we don't really have to declare those things ourselves. But it's a good thing to know about the language. And I'll kind of try and keep this ordered as I go. And we'll talk more about what this means in a minute, that it says class int, class float. We're going to learn more about objects and classes next week. But in Python, and this is sort of true in JavaScript, but it has a lot of asterisks and exceptions after it that's not worth going into. Python is sort of one of your classic object-oriented languages, as is Ruby. I think Java, I think PHP. We'll learn like what like objects are, but like everything is an object in Python. And so objects have a class, and that's what we're seeing here with this type command. And we can do all sorts of interesting operations in Python the same way we can with everything else. We can divide. And if the interesting thing here is like, if we looked at the type, it would probably be a float. And we can do all the normal math stuff. And I think the one good thing to point out is the modulo operator. And can someone remind me what the modulo operator is? Like what it does?
Yeah, it's used to find the remainder when you divide 2 numbers.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I wanted to make that 3.5. And a great use of the modulo operator is if the modulo returns 0, we know one number divides evenly into the other. That's like a classic use case for it. You will probably see that in some sort of coding challenge or programming problem. There's not a ton to talk about the other types. The one thing to note is, in JavaScript, Francisco probably talked about why, like, doing something like this is a bad idea, right? Or doing something like this is a bad idea, or doing something like this is potentially dangerous, right? Did he talk about type coercion in JavaScript? Does that ring a bell? Like JavaScript, if JavaScript sees this, it will try to turn this string into something it can compare to a Boolean. I think it'll actually turn it into a Boolean true. I think it'll actually turn this into the number 5, which is terrible. And this, like JavaScript, has a concept of truthiness, right? Like hello evaluates true because it's not null or false, which is falsiness in JavaScript. And to avoid that and do what is called like a strict equality comparison in JavaScript, we need these 3 equals. Thankfully, Python does not have that. In Python, we don't have to worry about the language typecasting in possibly dangerous ways like with JS. So that should be false, which is good because it's explicit, right? This is going to be false, which is good because it's explicit. And there is no triple equals. This is false, which is good because it's explicit. Right, and this kind of goes back to the Python principles. So this is a really great thing about Python. 4 is not equal 7. That should be true. Python strings are relatively straightforward. We can do it like this with double quotes. We can do it with single quotes too. I think the convention is to use single quotes unless you need double quotes, but I have to double check. Obviously, like in JavaScript, the importance of double quotes is when you want to stick something like a single quote inside there. That's special. Python has string interpolation. It's called an F string. And it looks like this. You just put the character F in front of a double quoted string. And then you use the curly brackets to interpolate the value in there. And F strings are really powerful. And any questions? Cool. So this is where Python starts to kind of get interesting and fun, is with its data types, because JavaScript is a little like, it doesn't have a lot of features for a language. Most languages give you a whole lot more. And so instead of arrays, which, as we'll learn in week 3, like an array actually is a specific kind of like data structure, and JavaScript arrays are not really arrays, they're really lists like we have here in Python. And you can do, and the JavaScript language has gotten so much better, like all these new language features, like, you know, that I'm still getting used to because I didn't use them as much. But Python and other languages have had them for a long time. Yes, I see a question.
What's the difference between a list and an array? I thought they were like just the same thing, just called different things.
Yeah, we'll get into it more in week 3, but like a real array, which is not what JavaScript has, is actually about like a data structure, kind of low level, how stuff is stored in computer memory. Like if you get low enough into how like memory is stored on a computer, and to some degree this is idealized because with solid state disks and stuff, I'm sure it's much more complicated. But essentially, you know, like you put like everything has a little slot in memory and they're all right next to each other, and each slot can only hold 1 byte or something like that. And so like the simplest way to put stuff in memory is all just one right after another. And an array is actually like a block of continuous memory, because then it makes it really easy to find stuff. Like if I know where my array is in memory, the 5th thing in the array is just that starting point plus 5. But this is at like a really low level with like memory indices and stuff like this, that languages like Python and JavaScript and even Java are operating like way above. And so that's kind of why like a JavaScript array is sort of a list in disguise. And we will talk about it more in week 3. And if anyone's interested, just ping me and I'll throw some links out for people to look at. So we can do all sorts of cool stuff with our lists. Just and in this class though, we are going to use those words interchangeably, arrays and lists, because I talk about JavaScript arrays all the time, and that's what I mean. And it just sort of like, I know it's not a real array, but we don't really care because we never really use those anyway, most of the time, unless you're writing in a really low level language like C. So you will hear arrays and lists used interchangeably. I will say it is good to get in the habit of using the term of the language that you're working in. So I will try to be consistent. I do try to be consistent. And if I'm working in Python, it's a list. If I'm in JavaScript, it's an array, because that's what they're called in each language. So with lists, we can access elements in the list and index the way you'd expect. Right, the 0th element in the list, I have to keep myself from saying array now. The first element in the list, as you guys may have seen, the last, is it the last? It is indexing backwards with negative indices. And something very cool about Python lists, and JavaScript is getting more and more of this, but this is a lot of why people love Python. It's very easy to get a slice from a list. Note that this gets me, let's see, I want to make sure that I have it right, that it starts at the right index. So we just printed out cucumber and eggplant. So 0, 1, 2. So this is inclusive. So it's start is inclusive. I believe the end is exclusive because 2 to 4, right? 0, 1, 2. We got the cucumber. 3, we got 3. We did not get 4, the banana. So this is a good example of, and really you kind of got to just do like a bunch of leak code and programming problems, or just writing lots and lots of code in Python to remember that. But that's a good example of something where it's not the end of the world not knowing that in a technical interview. I would probably look it up or just run a line of code to double check it. But that's such an easy way to get tripped up on a relatively simple problem. And that's a good example of what I mean by you want to know your language well. And what I know is that I don't know. So I'm going to double check to make sure that I figure out what's inclusive or exclusive. And just in case someone might not be familiar with those terms, inclusive meaning I give this index 2 here, 0, 1, 2, and it includes that in my slice. Exclusive as in 3, 4, this other index is excluded from my slice. It's not included. There's lots of other fun slicing that we can do. 0, 1, 2, 3. So this is, again, the end is exclusive. So the way to describe this would be slice from beginning to index 3 exclusive, right? We don't include index 3 in there. And then we can slice like this. So Python has so many cool language features. Let me just pause here and see if folks have any questions. Okay, cool. People feeling good? People feeling pretty comfortable? Awesome. I would say if you feel like, hey, I know this material, I've done a lot of this already, what I would encourage is coding along, I think can be useful. Or as you're going, if you run into questions, looking them up. Yeah, that's a great trick that someone threw in the chat there with reversing a list. Actually, I'll throw that in here too. I actually didn't know that. That's a good one. Let's see if I have this right. And this is where I will say there's a little bit of a point of, it's not diminishing returns, but this is, knowing this is great because that tells your interviewer, hey, this person really knows Python lists. Any other cool tricks with like list slicing that people want to share?
I have a question. You can't index backwards with negative indices in JavaScript, right?
I would have to run a little bit of JavaScript code to check. I'm not certain off the top of my head.
I was just referencing the print berries -1 because I've never done that in JavaScript, and you didn't list it under cool Python list features.
Yeah, we can find out real quick. And this is always the best way to answer this kind of question. I'm just going to run node. Let's just do berries equals, I don't know if a cherry is a berry, but a blueberry. And how about a blackberry? Berries Yeah, you cannot. You can with the slice operation use negative indices. And I don't remember the ins and outs of that off the top of my head. I always kind of need to like look again at the JavaScript docs for that. But so that's you can do it with JavaScript, but they just have like a slice operator or a slice function rather.
Cool, thank you.
Totally. And yes, Code Platoon has a clan on Code Wars. I think I made it. I have never really used Code Wars. I actually would love for someone to maybe walk me through it sometime because I would love to get us using it and get me more involved. It's just been a question sort of time and stuff. Moving on, another great Python data structure is tuples. A tuple is sort of like a list, but not. It's immutable. You can't really change it. And it's meant for storing things together. Like coordinates would be a good example, maybe. And let's play around with tuples a little bit. And there's actually a good example here that we have. And it's good because we wrote it. Days of the week. This is not the worst way to write this. There are a lot of interesting things you can do with tuples as well. You certainly can access tuples by indices, just like with arrays. And let me pop back to where I have my Python code running here. And that would be because anyone want to tell me why I have an index error out of tuple index out of range error here?
Because index 6 doesn't exist.
Yeah, exactly. It's saying, hey, you don't have index 6 in your tuple. I forgot to add Saturday. And this is gonna, I think what I'll do is I'll just make a new file after this because I'm getting so many print statements and I don't want them to all pop up, but I don't want to comment stuff out either. So it's easier for you all to read. And in fact, let me go ahead and do that right now. So now that I've done this, I do have to slightly modify my enter program because it is only looking at this one file that I made, and it's only running that one file. So I'm going to do something like this. And this is, I have to say, the one problem with all this search stuff is and like at one point when I was using this all the time, I just made an alias, but we'll just do this. Find star.py, which finds all my files, which is good. And I am just going to tell enter. I'm just going to have to change it when I run a different file. And that's fine. And the command would be enter and not entry. And everyone can read this, okay? Cool. Are people doing good? My preference would be keep rolling, but if there's like a strong desire for a break, we can break. Okay. Yeah, I know I ran a bit long in the review, so I want to kind of roll through this and then we'll take like a solid break and then we'll talk a bit about test-driven development. And we're moving at a pretty good pace here. So Dictionaries, kind of similar to JavaScript objects, just a lot more specific. And as I go here, I'm going to do a bit of pasting just in the interests of time. Like a JavaScript object, dictionaries are great for holding like complex data. Oh, and there we go. Now we're getting what I want. Let's change Jeff's age to 45 just so I get it running again. Can you push a new item to a tuple? Oh, that's a great comment about if a tuple has only one item in it. Can you push a new item to a tuple? That is a great question. I'm actually not certain. Let's find out. Great way. I don't think tuple has a push operation, but I'm not sure. This is where the Python REPL is your friend because it makes it so easy to just do little experiments like this. So I've got a little tuple here. Since tuples are immutable, I'm pretty darn sure you cannot push anything to them. I think the whole idea is, as the word immutable applies, once you create it, you cannot modify it. Though I may be wrong here. I'm doing a little bit of Googling. We may be able to append tuples to each other. Let's see here. My tuple equals my tuple plus 4. How about this? Can only concatenate tuple, not into tuple. Oh, thank you for the example. Oh yeah, and of course right, I would have to do something like this. Or just do it the other way. So we can do tuple concatenation. Those are actually really good examples to add. I'm just going to use the plus equals operator for conciseness here. Actually, I'll just use, I'll write it out full form to make it a little easier. And my tuple is not a berry. Sorry, my tuple is a day of the week. Actually, I will do plus equals because now that's just too long. Blur's day. That is clearly a day now that the pandemic has happened. And I don't know, any other imaginary days that we want to add? Fun day, the worst of all days.
Saturday.
What?
Saturday.
Saturday? As in CAT?
Yeah, it's a big thing on Twitter.
Oh, I did not know that. Perfect. And we'll print. I'm not going to run it at the moment just because I've got my little script working with the other file. But you all can see the example and run it. Francisco, you may want to jump in a bit, or I can follow up with you in a bit on the point you were mentioning in chat. If you want to jump in now and chat, we can do it now, or we can talk about it a bit later. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna follow up with you guys a bit later. I got a little good advice in a side channel that a common technical interview question is the difference between a tuple and a list in memory. Excuse me. And I actually don't know the difference between a tuple and a list in memory in Python. So I'll leave that as an exercise to the class. And then when we come back after the break, we'll take a quick look at that. And if anyone has Googled it and has the answer, awesome. Otherwise, I will share that information because that is very good to know. And Francisco, thank you, sir. Dictionaries, they look like JavaScript objects. They're not. You can do things with JavaScript objects like add functions to them. They're used for all sorts of things. Dictionaries, it's really a bit more about like just data. Keys and properties. I don't believe we have dot notation in Python. I could be wrong here. And indeed, no, dot notation is used for different things in Python that we'll see later with classes and objects. So dictionaries, you really do kind of have to refer to them this way. With you actually have to put the key in the double quotes. Like we kind of saw with the example from Roman numerals, these data structures are really powerful when they start to get nested. I'll just put Jeff here since we already created him, but I am going to copy and paste some other people from the lesson. So some more dictionaries. And, you know, we declared this dictionary here, but it's still just a dictionary. So we can put it in our list just like we do with all the others. And I am going to do a little quick formatting with my Python formatter black. And then we've got a nice list of people here that we can see. And we can iterate through, right? We can use, we'll see like using for and loops and so on and stuff in a minute. And if we want to look at information about a particular person, we do it like so, and we can get Alice's name. I think I will just do this and I'll just come back to that later. Functions in Python, we use this keyword def, which is short for define. And we use a semicolon to indicate where the function starts. And we'll see that that's like the standard Python syntax for all sorts of things. My personal preference, once you define a function and it's done, please leave an empty line. I think it makes it way easier to read. I'm going to comment out my other print statements here just so that we only see the stuff that we care about. I mentioned Python caring about white space. Note that changing the indentation of this return statement actually throws an error. So let's see here, return outside function. Oh yeah, because there is no return statement. That's why it's throwing, that's why it's not even getting there. We could look at it this way if we want. There's a bunch of ways to break this, but the important thing is, like, you know, in JavaScript, you declare a function and indentation is really for our own readability, because the people who design Python care so much about readability, and I kind of do agree with them. The indentation actually matters for blocks, code blocks, right? Whether it's for functions or if statements and things like that. Any questions about that? I think that one's relatively straightforward, but always good to mention.
I have some questions about the dictionaries.
Yes, what's up?
Okay, so just to double check, we can't put a function in the dictionary. That's my first
Well,
question.
we sort of can, and we'll see that in a minute. But it does not work the same way as JavaScript.
Okay, and then I guess my other question was, are we making a list to put multiple objects in, or can we actually make a list to put multiple dictionaries in, or can we actually embed dictionaries within dictionaries?
That is a
I
great
guess I'm caught up
question.
on the brackets versus the
Yeah.
swirly ones.
That is a great question, and we can do all of those things. For example, Jeff can have favorite foods. So dictionaries. Let me start off by showing what I mean about functions, since that's sort of, I think, the major difference from JavaScript. So let me just grab Jeff here, and instead of Jeff, this is going to be Kyle, since K comes after J. I don't know, default action. I sure hope I'm wrong here, because I don't think this should work. I will be shocked that I'll have to eat my lunch if it does. Um,
You still need the brackets to access it in
oh,
Python, right?
of course. Yeah, thank you so much, Megan. My brain is just, in fact, I'm just gonna name this action because that is too many words. I see there's a question in chat. I'll get there in a minute. So if we print this out, it does, let's clear this buffer. So, actually, Clarice, I'm so glad you asked that. I actually would not have thought that we can do that. It does sort of make sense, I guess, that we can. So I guess we can, let's just, I'm going to put a print statement in here just so we can see what's going on. So I apologize, I was wrong. Apparently, we actually can assign functions as values this way in Python. Which looks very similar to JavaScript. However, under the hood, different things are happening that we will talk about when we start talking about object-oriented programming. And when we get there, because Python has classes, so it makes sense that you can do this in the language. I guess I get it, but you never would, because Python has the idea of a class, and I won't get into it too much, but it looks something like I don't know, something like this. I'm not going to try and write it all out because I'll get it wrong off the top of my head, but so this is not 100% correct Python code, but this is the essence of what we're going to see next week with Python. that if you want a thing that has both data and functions, you use a class. Under the hood, and actually maybe this is why it's working, Python very well may be creating a bunch of dictionaries assigning functions to this, but my understanding is most people do not write Python this way, and you will see very little code written this way. And again, we want to use what our language gives us and sort of use it the way that it's been designed and intended to. And once we learn about classes and objects, like a class, it's a little more complicated, but it's extremely powerful. And so you use this. And so the question was, are dictionaries the same, Python dictionaries the same as JavaScript objects? The answer is sort of, not really. Really in Python, like the way you might make a complicated JavaScript object that has a bunch of data and also some functions and stuff on it, that's when you make a class in Python. Dictionaries, we can have, we can combine our data structures in as many ways as we want. To kind of go back to your other question, Clarice, which is a really good one. Like we can have all sorts of things. Like Jeff can have dietary restrictions, and maybe that is then a list of dictionaries, allergies, like something like peanut and shellfish. And then just how about doesn't eat vegetables, which is, you know, doesn't make any sense, but just as an example. So we can combine these all the different ways that we want. We can, any of our data types, dictionaries, lists, tuples, like I'm trying to think of something that might be good for a tuple here. This is not going to make a, just to show a tuple example. Honestly, you'd probably use a list here, but just to show the example, you can combine these in all you can combine them all around with each other in essence. And it looks like I'm getting this red squiggly because I didn't put my single quotes. Yeah, great question about function hoisting in Python like JavaScript. No, function hoisting is a weirdness specific to JavaScript. And Francisco, thank you. Clarice, does that help sort of like illustrate the different ways that we can combine and play with dictionaries and lists and tuples?
Yep.
Cool, awesome. And actually, yeah, I'll talk about that. So I'll just make a note here. You can assign function to a dictionary key, but you should not. In Python, we would create a class or something like that. Like with every rule, there are exceptions and times to break it, and where that is good engineering. But as a general guide, and certainly for learning and sort of standards, and what most of the code you're going to see is this is a good rule. So yeah, great questions. And really, JavaScript is the odd man out here. Most object-oriented languages are much more like Python. JavaScript, under the hood, does stuff differently, is the very short answer to that. let's see here. We were talking about functions. Important things to note with functions are that we can have one or more parameters. Order does matter for functions. And here I'll use a little F string in here. And I need to fix my F string. So give me 1 sec here. And that looks almost right. There we go. So this is kind of cool. If you use the star key with a function, then and the special keyword args, you can pass as many arguments as you want. So star args is this sort of special Python keyword. And note, I'm passing as many arguments as I want. You can do what are called keyword args, which is useful, where you can give the arg a name. Let's do describe berries is our example here. And you can also, in fact, to set a default value, which is incredibly useful. You may need to use it to set a default value, in fact. And let me make sure I have this right before I run this code. And then it looks something like this. You will also hear keyword args referred to as like named arguments. And the nice thing is the order does not matter because we have to set this anyway. And I'm going to go ahead and fix my typo. So does that make sense about keyword arguments? I just want to check and see if folks have any questions. Okay, cool. The last thing that we can do with keyword arguments that's kind of cool is there is a special keyword args or quargs argument we can use, because under the hood, Python is keeping a list or a list of dictionaries or something like that. And we can pass as many keyword arguments as we want without having to define them. Generally, you want to define your arguments. It's not, you shouldn't be using args and quargs as normal things unless there's a good reason to. And the way that you access both the name of the keyword argument and the value of it is like this. So it's actually creating a list of dictionaries, right, is what's going on. We get a keywords list, and then we access in each list, there must be like a little dictionary in there. And let me just make sure that I have this right. And in fact, I am going to change this a little bit because it is confusing me. I feel like I'm misspelling something. So let's run this and see if I am or not. And it looks like I have, there we go. I had the argument spelled wrong. So this is cool. I mean, this is very powerful. As you can see, I can create a function. I can pass as many keyword arguments as I want. That said, use with caution, because the challenge here is you have no idea what you're going to get. So again, I think the rule is always start out specifying your arguments and named arguments, and only use star args or star quargs if you really need to. Why don't we take a short 5-minute break and then we can keep on rolling? How's that sound, folks? Awesome. Thank you everyone very much. Let's take a real 5. I'm not gonna I'll throw a timer up and then we'll just keep on doing our thing. See everyone in a little bit.